Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Spoken of Only in Whispers, Volume 7, Story Number 1. The man in seat 43A died halfway across the Atlantic. I was sitting near the front of the plane, just behind first class, and couldn't really see the commotion, but I could hear someone gasping and retching, loud at first, then quieter and quieter. A flight attendant got on the PA and asked for any medical professionals among the passengers to help. I guess there were none. After a few minutes, the man's sounds deteriorated into a sort of gurgle, then silence, then it was over. His name was Molyneux, and he was old, but not that old, and it was likely a heart attack, aneurysm, drug reaction, or God's will, according to conflicting in-hand reports that filtered down the plane from row 43, where a flight attendant simply buckled the newly deceased back into his window seat and covered his face with a complimentary airline blanket. The pilot got on the intercom and told us the plane would be turning back to New York due to a tragic medical situation involving one of our passengers. Folks, we're looking for a volunteer willing to sit next to the deceased while we return to our originating airport. The pilot continued, "This flight is entirely full, and the person sitting there now isn't feeling comfortable. It's an aisle seat, and it will only be a few hours before we're back over land." I'm not sure why I volunteered. Probably some combination of exhaustion, altruism, and morbid curiosity. My vacation plans were shot anyway. I figured, so why not take the most interesting seat on the plane? The flight attendant thanked me profusely, as did a queasy-looking teenager who took my original seat. I picked up my handbag and shuffled down the aisle to the very last row of the plane. My only prior experience with corpses was an open casket funeral for my grandmother when I was a kid, but the idea of death had never particularly bothered me. It's natural, after all. That said, I admit that I second-guessed my decision as soon as I saw my new seatmate. Mr. Molyneux, rest in peace, sat upright between the window and me, strapped around the waist with a blue fleece blanket covering his torso and head. The blanket did not cover his hands, which were resting on his lap, above his seatbelt, placed that way by a flight attendant as a sign of respect, I assumed. Molyneux's pale fingers were twisted into claws that betrayed the agony of his death. I couldn't look at those hands without imagining what his face looked like under the blanket. I thought of asking for a second blanket, but the flight crew was still busy calming down other passengers and preparing for our U-turn around the Atlantic Ocean. So I tried to forget my uneasiness and closed my eyes and slept. I woke, hours or minutes later, I don't know, to the jostling of turbulence. The cabin lights were off and most of the passengers around me seemed to be sleeping. I looked out the window, trying not to look at Molyneux as I did, and saw only the uniform blackness of the night. I imagined the ocean miles below us, lightless and cold. The thought unsettled me, and I reached across Molyneux to close the window shade. Then I stopped myself. Hadn't the shade been closed when I sat down? I realized there was something else off about the scene. Molyneux's posture had somehow changed while I slept. It took me a few seconds to pinpoint it. His gnarled hands remained on his lap. He was still belted at the waist, and the blanket still shrouded his upper body, but the fabric looked somehow twisted now, as if he had been fidgeting. Very slowly, knowing it was insane, even as I knew I couldn't stop myself, I lifted a corner of the blanket. I uncovered his shirt, which the flight crew had unbuttoned while trying to save him. A patch of blue-gray skin, sprouting white hair, peeked out from beneath. I lifted the blanket higher. His collar was flecked with dried blood. I remembered his terrible gasping. Finally, I pulled the blanket entirely off and stifled a scream. Molyneux's head was turned away from me, exactly as if he had turned to stare out the window. I could see his face reflected in the plexiglass. It was undoubtedly a dead man's face, pale, drawn, lips parted, jaw slack. There was no life in it, except his eyes. They were moving. I stared at the reflection for half a minute, and I'm sure of it. In the center of that death mask, two pupils flicked back and forth as if tracking something out there in the sky. "What are you doing?" A voice beside me interrupted. I whipped around and saw the woman seated across the aisle staring at me, not so much in fear as disgust. Cover him back up. Give him his peace. He's. I think he's been moving, I stammered. His eyes. I think he might not actually be. But I couldn't finish the sentence. It was too crazy. Nor did I have to because at that moment my stomach dropped 10 feet along with everything else in the plane. Coffee cups and purses slammed against the ceiling. A man near the first class section nearly tumbled out of his seat. I heard call lights going off all over the plane as passengers were jolted awake in panic and confusion. Passengers, please take your seats, buckle in, and secure any loose items, the pilot said over the PA, sounding shaken himself. The weather along our flight path is clear and no planes in the area reporting turbulence, so I'm not sure what this is, but we should be through it momentarily. Even as he spoke, the mild background shaking I'd felt since waking up became noticeably more violent. The woman across the aisle began fumbling for her seatbelt, no longer paying any attention to me or Molyneux. I forced myself to look at him again. The jolt must have caused him to pitch forward at the waist, his head colliding with the seat in front of him. But Molyneux's face was still turned toward the window. His neck twisted at such a sharp angle that I worried it had snapped. I looked at his hands again, and the pallor of his skin. 3 flight attendants and a dozen passengers had witnessed this man's death, and I could not rationally imagine they were mistaken. And yet, in the reflection of the window's eyes, left to right, left to right, I had heard that strange reflexes sometimes kick in after death. Limbs flailing, headless chickens running, nerves clearing out the last backlog of instructions from the brain. But the eyes? I had never heard of that. I made myself look past that unsettling reflection, at the sky itself. It was still dark, moonless, and cloudless, but the atmosphere seemed to have taken on a strange hue, a very dark green, like pea soup fog. I thought I could see vague shapes swirling around in the murk, though it might have been an optical illusion. I recoiled. I desperately wanted to be anywhere else right then, but the rest of the cabin was approaching a state of pandemonium. Flight attendants were hurrying up and down the aisles, attending to spills and bruises, even as they tripped and staggered. The entire plane was shuddering like a barrel going down the rapids. A series of jolts sent Molyneux's upper body swinging back and forth like an upside-down pendulum. He was thrown backward into his seat, then sideways into me, a horrible feeling I will never forget. And in the opposite way, his face slamming directly into the window where it came to rest. That was enough for me. I unbuckled, leapt out of my seat, and locked myself in the bathroom directly behind me. I would cower on a toilet for the rest of this hellish flight rather than spend another minute sitting with Mr. Molyneux. The plan worked for a half hour or so. I braced both my arms against the bathroom walls and listened to the chimes of flight attendant call buttons, the whine of jet engines, and the growing of the sky getting darker. I tried to calm myself by visualizing the skyline of New York, the JFK airstrip, a calm descent. But then I imagined Molyneux's window, his face mashed up against the glass like a little boy's, his dead eyes searching the night. The captain's disembodied voice called me back to reality. He sounded outright scared now, and the PA kept cutting in and out. Extremely anomalous weather. Need everyone in their seats in the emergency position immediately. If we depressurize. The turbulence stopped for 4 or 5 seconds, and then suddenly it felt like I was inside a washing machine. I bounced against the walls of the bathroom, landed on the floor, and could barely manage to get the door open and crawl on all fours into the aisle. All 3 flight attendants were down, sprawled on backs and bellies between the seats. Some of the overturned luggage bins had burst open and spewed baggage out. Many of the passengers were weeping. A few prayed. And through it all, the plane would not stop shaking. I heard a series of small bangs above my head and felt something wet on my cheek. Every single soda can in the galley had exploded. I climbed into my seat and belted myself in, having briefly forgotten about Molyneux in my terror. Thwack, thwack. But he was still in his seat, of course, whipping back and forth like a flagpole in a hurricane, head-butting the window so hard that I could see the plexiglass balloon outward and rebound each time. Thwack. I became worried. He'd cracked the window, though that's supposed to be impossible. So I overcame my revulsion and grabbed his shoulders, but I couldn't restrain him. Again and again his head hit the window. I began to fear that it was not simply the motion of the plane that compelled him. Thwack, thwack, thwack. No one else in the plane was watching this. Some of the passengers had rallied and were trying to pull the injured flight attendants out of the aisle. Others were whispering goodbye messages into their phones. Thwack, thwack, grrr. I heard something crack beside me and hoped desperately that it was Molyneux's skull and not the window. Outside I could see that the green fog was alive with swirling amorphous shapes. Thwack, grrr. Another explosion. Not pop cans this time, but pressurized oxygen escaping into sky. Molyneux had managed to smash out both window panes in one final blow. Now his mangled head was hanging outside the plane, and the rest of his body was straining to follow it, restrained only by his seatbelt and the width of his shoulders. An alarm went off in the cabin, and a jungle of oxygen masks fell from the ceilings. I put mine on at once, but I heard other people screaming. Some passengers were trying desperately to get masks on the unconscious aircrew, but the plane was shaking more violently than ever, and loose debris was flying up the aisles towards my row, toward the hole a dead man had made in the airplane. Cabin breach, said the pilot. Limited backup oxygen, so I'm trying to descend to a safe altitude. But hard to do that in this storm or whatever it is. God be with us. Once I was sure that I could breathe and was in no danger of being sucked up myself, I took one last look at Molyneux. His head might have torn clean off outside the window for all I could see of it past the rest of his body. I pictured those eyes again, which had been something looking in the sky that we had not seen, could not see, even as it now threatened to shake the plane apart. There was some connection between these events that I might never understand, but even without understanding, I could make the last move available to me. I reached over Molyneux's lap, lifted one of those cold, clawed hands, and unclasped his seatbelt. There was an intolerable crunching noise as, I presume, his shoulders were squeezed and crushed to fit the window frame. And then, in a split second, he was gone. Out the window into the night, a pale old man falling end over end toward the black ocean. Whatever you saw out there, I whispered. Whatever you were looking for, go to it and leave us be. The green fog lifted a few minutes later and the plane descended until it was safe to breathe without the masks. Less than an hour later, I really did see the JFK airstrip. A whole squadron of police and ambulances met us on the way down. The flight attendants and several passengers had to be hospitalized, but as far as I know, no one suffered serious injuries. Federal investigators eventually concluded that we had flown through a localized weather anomaly, witnessed by no other plane in the sky that night. Some sort of debris must have been flying around up there with us and taken out the window at 43A, they wrote in their report. This event led to a sudden loss of cabin pressure, in which the body of a passenger who had died earlier in an unrelated medical emergency was ejected from the plane. I expected to hear a lot more about it on the news, but I suppose in the end it was just one of those things. The airline had no interest in publicizing the incident, of course, and the passengers had no desire to relive it. For most people on the flight, it was simply a freak tragedy, followed by a close call, and all's well that ends well. I'm the only one that will dream for the rest of my life about Molyneux's eyes and what they saw on the way to the ocean. Story number 2. It was around 2 a.m. in the morning. I was just on my way back from the hospital. My partner Vern and I had just dropped off a man who had fallen in the middle of the night. The man was in his early 80s and fell in the bathroom. He busted his head on the tile floor. Poor man lived alone. He would be okay. He needed a few stitches. We were both exhausted from lack of sleep. When you're an ambulance driver, you really get very little sleep. Coffee is our best friend. We made a pit stop at the Quick Mart for a cup of joe. Vern had to pee really bad and told me to take a shortcut through the Rockford Road. I was hesitant at first. Rockford Road was a dangerous road. I always hated to take it. There were too many twists and turns, and always an accident. I was super tired and didn't want to risk it, but I did anyway. Hey, When a man's gotta go, he's gotta go. You just can't hang out the window. My partner and I began to chit chat like we always do. Vern was telling me about his ex wife, his sixth ex wife to be exact. That man surely got around. Vern was a muscular man with a rat tail and an earring. He looked like he should have been a bouncer, not an ambulance driver. He told me how he cheated on his wife, Jenna, with a younger chick. Jenna had found out and filed for divorce. The girl was 15 years younger than his wife. Vern told me he wanted to marry the young gal after the divorce. I told him I thought he was nuts. "What's that?" Vern suddenly shouted, pointing out the window. I tapped the brakes, expecting to see a deer notice what Vern was pointing at. In the darkness, lit up only by my headlights, was a figure of a man. He was waving his arms, flagging us down. His hands were full of blood. I stopped the vehicle. My headlights were blaring into him. I could see him clearer now. We both jumped out, fully prepared to take on anything. I expected to see a car flipped over in the ditch, but there was no car in sight. I knew Rockford Road only for its many tricky curbs. We had been out on this road multiple times for wrecks and fatalities. I had seen many decapitations, body parts strewn on the road, dead drunk teens flipped over in their cars, people cut in half. I've seen it all as an ambulance driver. The skinny man had a long, shabby beard and was wearing a blood-stained plaid shirt. I noticed a few scrapes and bruises on his hands. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked. The man then spoke. "I need to go to the hospital. I think I broke my ribs. My car is all the way over there in the ditch." My partner and I accessed him and loaded him up on the stretcher and into the ambulance. "He might have internal bleeding," I told Vern. "We need to get him to the hospital to get checked out." I jumped in the driver's seat, ready to flip on the sirens. Vern would start the IV and monitor his vitals. Suddenly I heard a loud, piercing scream. I turned around. It was Vern. My mouth dropped open in horror. Was I really seeing this? The man we had just picked up was trying to stab Vern with a knife. "Shit!" I yelled. "Help! This guy's a lunatic!" Vern was panting. He was trying to fend off the attacker. The skinny man was laughing an evil laugh. I jumped behind the seat and tried to apprehend the man. He raised a blade and swiped it at my hand. "God damn it!" I yelled. Blood oozed out. I think he hit a vein. It burned really bad. I didn't have time to think of the pain. I had to stop this. I had to stop him. For a skinny little man, he was strong. Vern was trying to knock the blade out of his hand and was unsuccessful. I could see where he nicked Vern in the neck. It was a bad cut. 3 men rolling around fighting in an ambulance is a challenge. I tried to punch the attacker again with my fist. I clocked him in the side of the head, not once but twice. "Ugh!" He moaned, and then he slumped down. I let out a huge sigh of relief. Vern was holding his neck, grabbing for gauze and the first aid kit. Suddenly I felt the ambulance shaking. What the? There was no earthquakes around here. Then I realized what was going on. I looked out the side of the window and saw hands all over the window. White palms pressed to the glass. Many sets of hands. They were shaking the ambulance back and forth. The ambulance began to sway and rock. I looked over towards Vern. His face turned white as a ghost. I heard the voices chanting, "Tonight we will feast. Tonight we will sacrifice for the beast." "Oh, hell no," I yelled. We had stumbled onto a cult. I suddenly realized that they set us up. That skinny man had not been injured at all. He was just a pawn in the game to draw out the rest of the cult. Their clever plan had worked. I braced myself the best I could. The ambulance rolled down the hill. I felt my body suspend in midair, hitting the ceiling. Rory and I's groaning in pain. It finally stopped. I watched horrifyingly as they drugged Vern out. He was moaning in pain. There were at least 6 of them, all wearing tattered clothes, women and men. No one tried to grab me, thankfully. The crazy cult seemed focused on Vern for the moment, and this was my chance to escape. I used my upper body strength and slid myself forward. My whole body ached. Luckily, the ambulance door was wide open. I watched the terrifying view in front of me. Vern screamed and he pleaded with the last little bit of strength he had left. They all had knives and cut at his flesh. Sharp, pointy-looking buck knives. I couldn't look. I had to escape. My chest was hurting, my heart was pounding, and it was hard to breathe. My nose was dripping blood. Once I slid out of the wrecked ambulance, I stood up carefully. I was a bit dizzy and wobbly, but I managed to run a little. Limping and groaning in pain, I dared to look back. Vern was lying sprawled on his back. He was no longer a man with a face, just a bloody, pulpy slab of meat where his face used to be. I leaned over and grabbed my knees in disgust, vomiting up the Big Mac I had earlier that day. The whole cult of people seemed to be in a trance, their faces all bloody, going on Vern's raw flesh. I glanced at an older woman with long gray hair chewing on what looked like to be Vern's ear. These people were psycho. There was no time to stick around. I didn't want to be next. I started to run. I felt the cold night air going into my lungs. I was almost to the highway and I yelled frantically, waving my arms. Maybe someone would stop. No cars were coming. Suddenly I felt a hard thud in the back of my head. Darkness enveloped me. I woke to the bright lights laying on a bed with a white sheet over me. Where was I? Was I dead? Am I in heaven? The questions raced through my mind. To my relief, a nurse walked right in. She stood by the bed and spoke. I'm glad you're awake. David, you're in the hospital. You're very lucky to be alive. Then it all flooded back. Vern, the skinny man in the cult. Where's Vern? I demanded. Is he okay? The nurse frowned. I'm so sorry he didn't make it. Tears welled up in my eyes. You were very lucky to survive such a horrible bear attack. I cut her off right away. Bear attack? No, I yelled. It was a cult of people that murdered him. They ate him alive. I tried to jump out of bed frantically and the nurse ran to grab me before I hit the floor. She was telling me to calm down and called another nurse for backup. I looked down. The white sheet had fallen off. My legs. Where are my legs? I nearly passed out. I was staring down at two bandaged nubs that had eaten my legs. I began to scream. Next story. I was a paramedic out of a small town in Southern California called Hemet. We're a very small division of the largest ambulance company in the United States, which was previously an even smaller company that was bought out by this larger company. Being a paramedic is a very weird job. And when I first started, it was like the Wild West of pre-hospital medicine. We all had great training. We knew how to respond to pretty much every emergency. But we were often, and are still often, mistaken for glorified taxicab drivers. On any given night, I would come in, check on my ambulance to make sure I was fully stocked and functional. Then my partner and I would bounce from station to station until someone would call because they had an emergency ranging from a gunshot wound to the head to a stubbed toe. No joke. I run calls at 3 a.m. for a stubbed effing toe. People often ask me, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? The truth is, they don't want to know. You don't want to know. They don't want to know and I don't want to tell it, so I won't. Maybe one day I will write about it as a sequel, but honestly, it's short, it sucks, and neither of us will be feeling like anything less than shit. What I will do is break the ice to the possibility of a bunch of stories with hands down the weirdest call I've ever ran. This is that story. Just north of Hemet is a city called San Jacinto. In the northernmost part of this town is a large, sprawling complex for a very controversial religious organization. It's not a secret, but I don't care to call them out by name as they tend to be very vengeful, and I do have a career that I would like to keep. If you can't find it quickly, just look up San Jacinto Golden Era. You'll figure it out. As a young medic, I worked a graveyard shift. One night around 3 a.m. we received a call for a man down located at the aforementioned compound. Man down can literally mean anything. When someone calls 911, the phone call goes directly to the local police or sheriff's department. If the call is determined to be of medical nature, it is forwarded to the fire department that will then call out their fire station over the radio. And from there, the private ambulance company will listen to that radio call and then tell us what the call is. While we can sometimes hear this chain of events over the radio, it is often a complex game of telephone in which my uncle fell down the stairs and had a large laceration across his leg turns into a man down. So as usual, we hopped into the ambulance and drove to the compound with lights and sirens blaring and 3 a.m. with no one on the road because our company would quickly fire us if we were to use common sense and drive there just as fast without waking up 10 neighborhoods on the way. Upon arriving at the compound, we were greeted with an open gate. This gate was always closed. A couple of guys standing by and one dude on a dirt bike. No joke, the dude was on a dirt bike. At the gate, I rolled the window down to speak to one of the guys at the gate, and he just pointed at the guy on the dirt bike, at which point this guy on the dirt bike took off. Well, I don't understand sign language. I was pretty sure I was supposed to follow this dude. After driving around the compound for a couple of minutes, we pulled up to a large building that was reminiscent of an early 1900s chapel. I got out of the ambulance and asked the guy on the dirt bike, "What's up?" And he pointed up to a woman standing in front of a large wooden doors leading into the chapel. I rounded the back of the ambulance where my partner was already pulling out the gurney that had our hot monitor, defibrillator, and drug bag on it. I grabbed onto the gurney and we headed up the stairs. Yes, we had to carry a heavy ass gurney up the stairs. This was part of our life. We got to the top and the lady turned, opened the doors, and walked in. Please keep in mind, we have now been in the compound for about 5 minutes. Ran into about 6 people, and not a single person has spoken a word. We rolled through the door and found ourselves in what appeared to be a large conference room. The walls were completely draped in what appeared to be large maroon velvet curtains spanning from the ceiling to the floor, approximately 30 feet. In the middle of this room was the absolute longest table I have ever seen in my life. This table was something you'd see in some movie mocking rich people in a mansion. No exaggeration. At least 100 feet long. If this isn't weird already, which it absolutely was to me, this table was surrounded by about 40 people wearing robes matching the curtains, with hoods over their heads covering their faces and not moving an inch. As I attempted to process the insanity of what I was seeing, the woman from the door grabbed my shoulder. I snapped my head towards her fast enough to break the sound barrier, and she just pointed past the table. At the complete opposite side of this 100-foot long table, there was a stage. The floor was completely covered in carpet that was the same crimson color of everything else in the room except the table. At the top of the stage, I saw what appeared to be a pile of white linen. My partner and I rolled the gurney along one side of the table. All the while, not a single person at the table said a word or moved. When we got to the stage, I realized what I saw was not a pile of linen, but rather a woman in a sheer white nightgown. As I approached closer, I noticed her nightgown was completely covered in small red dots. I got on my knees and proceeded to assess this woman by checking for a pulse, checking for respiration, both present, and then applying painful stimulation, a sternal rub, in an attempt to elicit a response. I got a very weak moan in response, and then was once again tapped on my shoulder. Before I could snap my head around again, my partner snapped, "Whoa! Keep your hands off of him!" All I could think of was, "Thanks for showing up, buddy." All the while I was thankful he was there, and I was thinking, where is the fire? The fire department absolutely should not have been here by now. They should have been on the scene at least a full minute before we were. I looked at my partner and said, "Let's load and go." Load and go is a term often used for the critically ill and or injured. A load and go patient is usually on the brink of death, and the best solution is to get them to the hospital as quick as possible and not waste time trying to help them on scene. We have time to start IVs, administer medication, and do a slew of other things en route in the back of the ambulance. This time, though, I just wanted to get the hell out of this place. We loaded the patient on the gurney and busted ass to get to the ambulance. Still not an effing word from anyone we'd seen. We loaded this lady up and my partner went to close the doors, but this woman that had been at the door to the chapel had followed us throughout and was trying to get into the back of the ambulance. I asked this woman to wait for a moment while I motioned for my partner to come to the side door of the ambulance. He walked up and I quietly told him to tell her she had to sit up in the passenger seat. The look on his face was that I would expect from a man I had just told he had to punch his own mother. So I said, "Tell her she has to sit up there, jump up, lock the door, and roll." He walked around the back, asked her to sit up front, shut the back door, and was blasting out his compound before I could completely process him putting it into action. En route, I started an IV, tested her blood sugar, but more importantly, did a full physical exam. I noted no less than 200 small pricks on her body. They all bled just enough to dot her nightgown and then coagulate. My suspicion was an overdose of some form, so I administered a drug called Narcan. which reverses the effects of narcotics. I love giving this drug as the results are almost instantaneous. And after about 5 seconds, the woman popped up, took a deep gasp, looked around, and said, "Where am I?" I instantly recognized not only her Australian accent, but who she was, a very famous actress married to a very famous actor that was well known in this religious organization. "Ma'am, what is your name?" "Deer and headlights, look." "Ma'am, can you please tell me your name?" She took a good look around, peeking in every corner, turning all the way around to try and look into the front seat area where my partner was. And then she turned to me and whispered, "Where are they?" "Ma'am, the only people in this ambulance with you are myself and my partner." She again spent a full minute examining everything. She then turned back to me with a look of complete fear I've never seen, and I said, "I'm fine. Please take me home." "I'm sorry, ma'am, we're taking you to the hospital for a full workup. I had to give you medication to wake you up, so we have to be thorough." "You have to?" she replied. "Yes, ma'am, you are completely safe and we are taking you to Hemet Hospital." "Okay, if you must." All the while, her face was frozen in fear. After about 10 minutes, we pulled up to the back of the emergency room. We rolled her out of the back of the ambulance into the emergency room. As soon as we got onto a gurney in the emergency room, she said, "I need to make a phone call." I grabbed the patient phone and handed it to her. She dialed the phone number, and to my surprise, she got an answer at 3:30 a.m. "Antonia?" Pause. "Tell me something only you know about me." Pause. "Okay, I need you to call Hemet Valley Hospital and ask for me. I'm in the emergency room. Don't ask any questions." And she hung up. 2 minutes later, I heard her secretary asking if it was okay to transfer a call to the patient, which it was. The phone rang at her bedside and the patient answered. "Hello? Yes, it is me. It is you. I really am here. I'm coming home." The woman turned to me and gave me her name. Rebecca Johnson, along with her address, social security number, and other information I needed. Rebecca Johnson was absolutely not what I thought this woman's name was, regardless. I finished up my report and left. This was absolutely a strange call, but we deal with strange stuff every day, so I tried to push it out of my mind. But I couldn't. For the next 6 months, I wondered what I had just witnessed. What had just happened? Was she really Rebecca Johnson? And then one day I was standing in the checkout lane at a grocery store when I saw the magazine. The woman I thought I treated was leaving her husband of nearly 11 years. Was it a coincidence? Or was it really her? And did she really flee some batshit crazy life? I may never fully know for sure, but it seemed like too much of a coincidence for me. I would be more than happy to answer questions, but remember, I have to obey the HIPAA laws.